Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Sunday Long Read podcast. My name is Don Van Natta. We're thrilled to share our new season called Source Material, a series of episodes all about people whose stories went from print to screen. If you like the Sunday Long Read podcast, please consider subscribing to our podcast and liking it on your favorite app. If you are new here, welcome. The Sunday Long Read podcast is an extension of the Sunday Long Read newsletter, which you can subscribe to at sundaylongread.com/subscribe. Let's welcome today's guest. She's had quite a bit of success having her wonderfully told stories adapted to the big and little screens. She is a National Magazine Awards finalist, a Massachusetts native who studied and worked in Philadelphia before moving to New York. You might know her for the stories that became the Netflix series Inventing Anna and the film Hustlers. She is Jessica Pressler. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Jessica, in a short time, two of your stories have become big hits on the screen. In one case, Julia Stiles even played you on screen, and we'll get to that a little later. Can you describe what these past 5 years have been like for you?
Well, the past 5 years, if we're talking about the times that the stories were adapted, it was like a different time. It was pre-pandemic. So then, kind of went into a muddle after that. But it was fun. The Inventing Anna and Hustlers kind of were developed at the same time. So even though they actually ended up coming out, I think 3 years apart because of the pandemic, those things were happening concurrently. So that was a very wild time to have both of those things happening at once. It was really fun and super interesting, and I learned an enormous amount and got a lot closer to the people that I'd been reporting on. It was like a whole new level of an experience. And in fact, I was portrayed twice. This is one of the weirdest things, is that there's a journalist character in both of those projects. So it's Anna Chlumsky in Inventing Anna and Julia Stiles and Hustlers. So that was a very strange thing to have happen all at once.
Very strange. And I want to talk to you about those portrayals and how accurate they were in a little bit. But let's unpack those two stories first. I want to start with the one that became the film Hustlers. That story was published in New York Magazine in 2015 and was titled The Hustlers at Scores. But the origin story actually goes back 4 years when you published a piece about Diane Passage, who stripped at Scores. What made you return to this topic?
So that I'm impressed that you know that. First of all, the Diane Passage was a dancer at Scores who married an accountant named Ken Starr, who was then arrested for running a Ponzi scheme, kind of like in the early days of that financial crisis. And I had remembered, and it was kind of this like anti-Cinderella story where Danielle, who is this, I'm sorry, Diane, I would call her Danielle. Diane kind of got introduced to this wonderful life through Ken Starr, and then it kind of all fell apart. And I remember talking to her about dancing at Scores and what that experience was like. And one of the things that she said to me really stuck with me, which was that it sort of caused her to think of men differently, to like think of them as like not, to dehumanize them in some ways, and to think of them as like ATMs. And so, a few years later, when I was reading, I think in the New York Post about the criminal case that was being brought against the women who would later become the subjects of Hustlers, I remembered that and how, she had just said that was the dynamic there. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting that it progressed to this level where they were drugging men and knocking them out and kind of not really thinking of it, thinking of them as human, as Whitney Houston says in Private Dancer.
Right.
So yeah, so it stuck with me, and that was, so they're linked in that way. And in fact, Diane then came to like a Hustlers premiere at some point and, connected with some of the girls in Hustlers, and it was a whole metaverse moment.
That is so fascinating that a one thing that you heard 4 years earlier that kind of stuck with you is what sparked your interest in that story when you read it in the New York Post, and to go dive back into it, right? It really was, okay, men are these ATM machines. That's the way these women view them. There's got to be a lot more here that I can explore and investigate.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I love that. So, did you have a feeling while you were reporting this story that it could garner some TV or film interest?
Um, I did. I did have that feeling during that story, which is a strange feeling to have, and it was because of the characters. I mean, the Rosalind Keough, who is, Destiny in the movie, was just very funny, very sharp, very smart. Um, like a good person, actually. Like, I think she's a good person who made a mistake. And I felt like, oh, wow, this is an amazing character. People are like, will connect to her. And the way that she's describing this is very cinematic for me in the moment that she's describing it. So I did kind of have that thought. But, I didn't actually think it would happen. So I was pretty surprised when it actually happened.
And as you were writing it, did you, in sort of the building of scenes in that story, you mentioned that she was cinematic. Were you trying to build scenes that were also cinematic, that a camera was there? Did you have that in mind as you were writing it?
I didn't have that in mind as I was writing it. I think that at New York Magazine, I kind of always looked up to the kind of old school, new journalism people, and scene construction, and that kind of literary Tom Wolfe thing was always a big part of that. So that was kind of where that comes from for me. Like, that was such a tradition of New York Magazine and how they told stories. So all of my stories were, I aspired to have them read like that. I thought it was much, I still think it's a much more palatable way to take in information if you're reading something and is kind of like novelistic, to the point where I annoy people very often that I'm interviewing by asking them for a lot of details, like what were you wearing and all that stuff, so that I can kind of make people see, how these events transpired. So I wasn't really thinking of it, oh, this is going to be a movie. It was more like, this is how New York Magazine articles, classic New York Magazine articles, are written.
Details are so important. We talk about that a lot on this podcast. I do the same thing, Jessica. I annoy people constantly, and sometimes while they're telling things, I reach for details, but I always go back. I'm curious if you do that. Once you have something down and you have a draft done, you go back to your sources to get even more details at that point.
Yes, I absolutely do. And I remember that story in particular, that Rosie saying to me, like, why are you so concerned with like when something happened? Like, I was trying to get the chronology of things, right? Like, oh God, why are you bothering me with this stuff? Yeah, always go back to them, always go back to them for those details. Because you don't want to interrupt them very often when they're telling you the story in the moment. So I do then bug them later.
Yeah, I do the same. So once the story was published, you sent it to Adam McKay, who you had just profiled. What was that like?
Yeah, that was a funny thing. That was a totally weird coincidence. He was making at the time The Big Short, which was an adaptation of Michael Lewis's book. And I really liked him. I thought he was great. I thought he was so smart and so funny and had the same fascination that I had with this like world of like, oversaturated wealth and how it corrupts people, and we were both very interested in that, and I actually just thought he would enjoy it, and was really, again, like, surprised. These things don't happen. Like, it was so unusual. It's like I sent him, like, literally the email was like, hey, hope you're well, thought you might enjoy this. It was like that kind of email. Didn't expect him to read it or even reply. But yeah, and then he kind of passed it on to his production company that he had with Will Ferrell, Gloria Sanchez, and Jessica Elbaum, the producer there, who is wonderful, was looking for female-oriented projects, and things kind of progressed from there.
But when you sent it to him, you really were just sending it to him, as you said, like, hey, I think you'll like this. This is right. I know your sensibility after profiling you. It wasn't like a pitch or anything like that. It was just, hey, I think you might like this. Or was it in the back of your mind, maybe, that there would be some interest that would go beyond him just reading it?
I don't think I even really knew that he produced things. So I don't think, or how the mechanics of any of that worked. It is super weird that I sent that. Like, it's not something that I would normally do, I don't think. Um, But yeah, I think I just really genuinely was like, I think he'll like this.
Yeah. Well, it
I
couldn't have
think there
worked
was
out
a
better.
scene in The Big Short that sort of was like, there was a stripper scene in that. I think maybe like my mind connected it in that way. But yeah, it was not particularly a pitch. It was just like, hey, I think I like this type of thing.
And I'm really curious then, once there was some interest, what was the sort of competitive process like? Were there a lot of people bidding on it, or was it only Adam's company, or, what was that like in the run up to it being made?
It's so funny to remember this. So, I think also it's important to say that at the time, there wasn't, as far as I was aware, like that much, you know, there wasn't this craze for like IP or intellectual property. Like
Mm-hmm.
there weren't as many things going from magazine article or book to film. Like it wasn't that rush of things. This was like what, 2016, something like that, maybe 2015. So yeah, that was not. I think that now, and I, you can sometimes see it. Like people engineer stories in order to get them, which
Yes.
I think is like a very dicey, weird thing to be in. But yeah, so at the time, it was like very not on my radar particularly. But sorry, what was your question?
Yeah, no, just about the process. I'm curious how many bidders were there? What was that like?
Oh, there were like no bidders. I think I
Oh,
had my
okay.
I think I had my agent send it, like he sent it to like 3 people. Like maybe I don't remember if it was even before or after Adam. Like he might have sent it out and like there were like a couple people who were interested, but most people were very put off at that time by the idea of a female anti-heroine or somebody like somebody who had done something wrong, an unlikable woman at that point. Yeah, so it must have actually been like 2015, maybe. Yeah, that was definitely not a thing that was again on people's radar as, oh, there we can make a movie about an unlikable or not, she is likable, but a difficult woman who is complicated and who has done something wrong.
Yeah, you were a trailblazer. Now there's, a lot of interest in those stories, but not, 9 years ago, right? It's
Right.
no, it's fascinating. What surprised you about making the movie?
Well, I didn't have anything to do with making the movie. I was like really like available for like phone calls if Laureen, the writer director, wanted to talk to me or talk to anybody, as writers often do, just to like talk through things. But I really was not involved in that. I remember it was like for me like a magical thing that happened where it was like first of all, it took years, it was like 2015. And then it was like occasionally you get some news like, oh, like we're looking at like this person, or they're like, oh, amazing, great. Like it was just all like kind of like good news for me. I think they were really working again because of the thing where it was a difficult character, and a lot of people were like, oh well, you can't have like, what if they're bad moms, and like it kind of looks like they're bad moms. Like, there was a lot of kind of it was hard to swallow this movie about women committing these kind of acts. But yeah, I kind of just like got these little blips of news, and then all of a sudden it was like happening, and it was happening like in 3 weeks. It was like a really fast thing, like years of just like, oh, maybe this person is interested, and like, we'll let you know. And then they cast Jennifer Lopez, I think. And then it was just kind of a quick
Right.
ride from there.
Yeah,
And
that's
it
the
was fun.
trigger.
It was fun. It was
It was
so
fun.
fun to like hear about. They were shooting in New York, and all the girls, the real girls, were texting me being like, their outfits are wrong. They need to look classier. But it was like everyone was like kind of excited and happy about it, which was a really nice thing. And then yeah, and it was like, oh my gosh, you got Cardi B, which was such a dream. I think like our first conversation was like, oh, so great if Cardi B was in this, and the cast was amazing, and yeah, it was just really fun. It was honestly really fun.
Was the screenplay shared with you early before the filming happened? And if it was, what was your reaction?
Yeah, I did. I read a couple of drafts. I read like an early draft, and then I think I read what ended up being kind of the final draft. It was so, it's so surreal to see that happen. But it was amazing in a way. Like, and it was very cool to see that there were some parts of it that were just like, this is exactly what happened. This is what was in the article. Like, that was really, really like wonderful to see and to imagine kind of being on screen. And I think that Lorene also was so sensitive to the people in the story, which was super important to me. That she kind of, be sensitive to them and understand them and not, make fun of them or, because this kind of thing sticks with you for the rest of your life when something is on screen. So she was very thoughtful about that.
Hello, I'm Albert Samaha. I'm an award-winning journalist at The Washington Post, author most recently of the book Concepcion, and the guest editor of the Sunday Long Reads True Crime Spotlight newsletter. Check out our monthly newsletter, where I'm curating the best true crime stories, from thrilling narratives through little-known underworlds to investigations that expose corporate or police misconduct. You can subscribe at sundaylongread.com/truecrime. That's sundaylongread.com/truecrime. Hope you'll join us. Peace.
I mentioned Julia Stiles earlier. She played a fictionalized version of you in Hustlers, and Julia came over to your place, right? And you guys had a play date. I think you both had 1-year-olds at the time.
We did. Yeah, she did. It's really funny. She came to Queens, like a totally normal person, where I live. And it was just like super sweet, super earnest. Exactly like you'd expect Julia Stiles to be, like very thoughtful, very like down to earth, asking me like, do you record on a tape recorder? Like, how do you take notes? Like, how do you react when people say these things to you? None of which I had ever really particularly thought about. So that was an interesting exercise for me as well. Yeah.
Oh,
And
that's
she was
great.
great.
What else did she ask you, and what did you learn from just spending time with her about how you do your job?
It's really strange. It's strange in this moment. I'm not used to being interviewed. So I really am used to being the person asking the question. So I was like, this is a really strange experience for me. And I have no idea what you would possibly want to know. Like, I have no perspective on myself. I'm like, this is fascinating. I don't know what to tell you. I realized I'm a terrible interview. I'm sorry that you're experiencing it now. But it was really strange being on the other side of that process for sure.
That's not
And
true.
that was
That's not
just the
true.
tip
First of all,
of the iceberg.
you're not a terrible interviewee at all. This has been a fun conversation. I've learned so much. But yeah, it's true though. Like, I find anytime I'm interviewed, the same thing. I'm not used to it. I've done thousands of interviews in my life, and when you're on the other side of it, right? It's uncomfortable. We're used to asking the questions. That's the fun. That's the fun thing, is asking the questions. Answering them is hard.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Don't want to be an actor anytime soon. That's for sure.
Did Julia ask to kind of follow you around, or was just the play date it? Was that the extent of the research she did on you?
I think that was it. That was the play date. Was it? She didn't ask to follow me around. I mean, that's the other thing that you learn, is the work that we as journalists do is so incredibly awkward. Most people don't want to do that. They don't want to be like, can I follow you around like a weirdo for days? Like, of course they don't, because it's a weird thing to want to do. So yeah, no, she's very polite and it was not like a role where I think she had to really do a lot of research. I think Lorene had done quite a bit for her in the writing. So yeah.
The two journalist characters in both in Hustlers and in Inventing Anna, tell me your assessment of them. How close were they to you and to the way you do your job?
Well, they're both different, but I think the funny thing about, and the thing that I very much empathize with, and anybody who's had themselves are portrayed or inspired by characters about them is that there are things that are so completely true mixed up with things that are like completely wrong. There's also like a shred of truth to things, and there's things that you might not recognize about yourself that are hard to see. And so one of the things in Hustlers, there's like a kind of like a class thing between the journalist and the Destiny character, which is the Rosie character in my life, where she says, like, you know, there's a conversation that they have where the Destiny character is like, you know, you didn't grow up like in a hard life. You didn't have a hard life like me. You went to like Brown or something like that. I did not go to Brown. So I was kind of like, when I saw that, I sort of like bristled. I was like, oh, I'm not like, I didn't go to Brown. Like, I'm not like, you know, it was, there wasn't that much of a class thing in real life that I saw, but there was. And like Lorene observed that. And like, that wasn't a thing that I had noticed or taken into account, particularly that we had that there was that, you know, divide. So that was really interesting to see that.
Where did you go to college?
Observed. I went to Temple University.
Oh, to Temple, right. Oh, that's right. I did know that.
Yeah, it's not Brown. And she says it in such a great, she says like Brown undergrad. It's like, oh, the undergrad is just like, I'm like, oh gosh. Not that it's bad that people think I went to Brown. I'm perfectly happy with that, but yeah.
Yeah. I also had read that you were surprised at sort of how confrontational as well, the sort of portrayal of you. I mean, we're not that confrontational as journalists for the most part. And there were moments, right, where there's this sort of scorched earth portrait of journalists that you felt was not the way you do your job.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember where that was. If that was like in I don't know if that was in Inventing Anna or if that was something that I was observing in somewhere else. But I do feel like there is, in movies and television, often there will show a journalist being like, well, I don't care what you have to say. Like, my job is to tell the truth and like nothing but the truth. Like some kind of like thing where you yell at somebody. And yeah, that is just not my style. Yeah. I don't know if other people do that. That's not my style.
Yeah, I mean, I have to do confrontational interviews because I'm an investigative reporter, and I never yell at people. Even when I'm confronting them, I try to do it politely and nicely. And yeah, and I that annoys me so much. There's too many portraits of journalists in films and television where they either get up on their soapbox or they're being mean to people, right? They're crowding. It's like Mike Wallace on steroids or something. And it's that's not reality.
Well, but I think it's like going back to the Julia Stiles, going back to Brown undergrad. Like, I think that it is a representation, like it's like an on-screen representation of a power balance that we don't recognize because we feel like these very awkward journalists asking awkward questions. But in fact, we are in like it's scary to the person that you're interviewing. So I think when you see that confrontation on screen, that's kind of what they're trying to represent, because they can't show the internal things that are happening, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I never thought of it that way, but I think that's a very perceptive view of it. Yeah. We're not on the other end of it. And when you are on the other end of it, it can be very intimidating, even though we don't feel as if we're being intimidating.
No, I feel like the least intimidating person in the world. And then you sometimes realize like, oh, just the fact of my being a journalist is scary to people. Like, I'm going to like translate your truth. I'm kind of like in control of things for you in a way that like is intimidating, but it doesn't feel like that to me personally. But I think that that's kind of what they're trying to show when they do that.
Yeah. And we're actually, what you just said triggered something in my mind about access that I want to get into, because I know you've written a lot of profiles. You've written a ton of profiles. And I saw in a story you quoted Kanye West in an interview where he said, doing a magazine article, it's like giving somebody else all your beats and letting them make the song, which is kind of what you just referred to. I love that quote. Is there a future for the kinds of celebrity profiles that you did so many of coming up?
Yeah, when Kanye was right, he was right about stuff. When he's right, he's right.
Yeah.
It's funny, profiles, every time I sign up to do one, I'm doing one now. I'm like, this will be fine. This is great. This is gonna be fine. It's always like, it's always like kind of stressful and celebrity profiles. Yeah, man, I don't know. I think that obviously we get less and less access, especially to certain people. People also have their own platforms now, where they're telling their own stories. I think it's just like an evolving thing, really. And like, it involves, for us, I think, like a lot more reporting, a lot of like different kinds of reporting, but it does also just ultimately feel like almost like a different breed of story to me. Like, sometimes like a personality profile is like you're going all in on the person, like, and like you're telling their story, and that's what that is sometimes, I think. And then sometimes it's you're going around the person and you're getting a lot of information depending on access. So I don't know. It's not what it was anymore, which is like you get, unfettered access, or you get this amount of access. It's like they're all different.
Yeah, and it's very managed, right? Sometimes you only get 2 or 3 hours with a person, or you go to lunch with them. I saw you quoted somewhere, these people are very charismatic. You have this lunch, you leave, you're kind of on cloud nine. You think you got all these great details, and then you look at the transcript, you're like, there's almost nothing here, right?
Oh,
Because
yeah, especially
they're
when
on
you like
guard
someone.
with actors
Yeah.
in particular, right? They're on guard and they're acting, they're playing,
Yeah.
they're playing you a little bit.
They're playing you, and they're charismatic, and they're actors because they're charismatic, or sometimes they just are charismatic. They're just like, really, that's just what they're like. Yeah, it's a really tricky thing. Like, when you have that super highly managed, controlled access to somebody, and you can't go back to them in the way that we were talking about before for details and stuff like that. That is very like hobbling, and I do try not to do too many of those anymore. But sometimes it's just like, okay, this article is just going to be a conversation with somebody, and that's what it is. And it's not going to be a piece of investigative journalism. And that's kind of all right, too.
When you don't get access, Jessica, you have to do the write around, right? Or the work around, however you want to call it, where you're going to go to other people to profile somebody. Do you like that kind of profile? They're tough.
They're tough. It depends. It depends on the situation. I mean, sometimes that can be better. It really depends on like who we're talking about. If you're talking about like a movie star, who's just in a movie that they're promoting, that's a different thing than like the CEO of Goldman Sachs who's in trouble for something, or, like some kind of, there's different degrees, I think, of things. But in some ways, I think write-arounds when you don't get access can be really freeing. I mean, I think of, in terms of classic New York Magazine stories, there was the Nancy Jo Sales story where she did the entire profile of Leonardo DiCaprio, Leo, Prince of the City, a classic.
It's outstanding.
Yeah, which has, he's not in it at all. And yet it's probably the best profile of him that exists.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. I'm curious what you learned the second time being part of an adaptation that you wished you had known the first time.
Well, since they both happened at the same time, it was for me really all at once. I mean, Hustlers began shooting on the day that Inventing Anna's writer's room opened. So it was like really all at once. And what I learned from it, I mean, I don't really know. I mean, like, it was like I was very concerned about the people, the real people, the entire time. Like, and I definitely spent a lot of time trying to make sure that the like movie TV people like were being kind to them, like to the extent that I had any control over it, which I did not, but like trying to like calm them down and try, because I felt very like in the middle of it in a way that like I actually had no control over it whatsoever. But so now I'm like, at the end of the day, yeah, I think like I would warn people that, you know, this is going to be like a little stressful for you. It's going to be an emotional roller coaster. It's going to be like, you're going to have feelings and like, you might want to like sleep on them before, you know, tweeting or something. I don't know. Like, you know, like just like, you know, talk to some, like it's an intense experience. So that's pretty much what I've learned from it.
And a big part of the intensity, I would imagine, is you're not in control, right? We're used to being in control of our stories, and we, you know, when it's adapted, it's in a lot of other people's hands. It's very collaborative, and they're gonna do their version of your story, and you kind of have to make peace with that, right? And it's tough when you have real life characters, as you're describing, who are very stressed about how they're going to be portrayed.
Well, and you're kind of their point person because you're the person they have access to. Like they're not reaching out necessarily to like Shonda Rhimes, you know, like you're the main point of contact for them. But yeah, I was really fortunate, I think, in both of these projects to have people who really, you know, took that stuff into consideration. And I think that maybe most people do. I think no one's trying to railroad a real person that they're writing about. They're like really, you know, you become like concerned with them and you're thinking about them and you're empathetic towards them. So that's, you know, a nice thing. That was a nice thing for me. They were very thoughtful.
One of the things I was really struck by in rereading these two stories that ended up on screen, and they're fantastic. We will link to them for our listeners. I'm sure our listeners know these stories, but if you don't, please take the time to read them. But they're about scammers, or kind of a certain version of scamming. What about scammers draws you to those types of stories?
You know, it's so weird because I don't particularly think I am drawn to those stories, or I didn't really see it as a theme at all at the time. Now I have, you know, every email in my inbox is somebody telling me about a scam. And I think that truly, and this is it came from being at New York Magazine, and I started there like right before the financial crisis in 2008 and covering Wall Street. And I think it just, I think that is actually the connective tissue for me. It was like covering Wall Street and like seeing this like kind of frog in hot water thing that happened with the mortgage crisis, where it's like you saw these kind of just like, you know, like mid-level bank employees get sucked into this thing where they're making all this money and suddenly they've done something awful. And I think that was the interesting story for me, is that they like people getting kind of sucked down this wrong path. So it wasn't so much the scam as like the characters and you know, that particular milieu, which I found to be like pretty relatable, because anybody can kind of get sucked into like, you know, going down a wrong path of some kind, or just getting too deep into something. Yeah, so that was the part that I found relatable. It wasn't so much the scam.
You grew up in Massachusetts and you read the Boston Phoenix growing up, which I read.
Wow, I don't even know how you know
that. which I read when I was at Boston University in the 80s, and it made a big impression on me as a young journalist. When did you start becoming interested in journalism, Jessica?
I mean, I guess probably then, although I would not have really articulated it at the time. I think I think probably then. It was so the alternative week, and that was my first job, was at an alternative weekly in Philadelphia. They were like very like witty, irreverent, fun, voicey newspapers. And I think that was definitely the gateway drug. And now that's kind of all that writing is. Well, I don't know where that writing is now. It's on the internet. I think it might be. Now it's in TikToks. I don't know. But yeah, I think that was probably the entry, the Boston Phoenix. That's amazing.
There were writers' papers, right? And there was a lot of freedom. And also, you know, there was, to use Jack Schaefer's term, Jack just did a column that there's not enough swagger among journalists. There was a swagger to the alt weeklies, right? I remember not just the Boston Phoenix, but the Miami New Times. My first job out of college was at the Miami Herald, and the Miami New Times, same thing. Just this great writing and a fearlessness among the reporters, and they wanted to go out and kick ass, you know.
Right.
And so that's a great place to start. if you're going to end up, covering the financial crisis at New York Magazine in 2008, that's a pretty good place to kind of, cut your teeth at an alt weekly in Philly.
Yeah. I mean, they're very like personality driven, and the paper that I worked at was very personality driven. And you're right there, and we were all very influenced by like the Village Voice and New York Magazine. In fact,
yeah. Our producer, Megan, has a few questions, very quick questions that I want to ask you. She says, I used to read your Gossip Girl recaps back in the day. And she asked, do you still have a special place in your heart for Gossip Girl?
Oh my gosh. First of all, the most popular thing I have ever done in the world is the Gossip Girl recaps. Like, it is 100%. It's the thing that people talk to me about. And yes, I definitely have I was kind of mad when they did the reboot. And then Chris and I thought like, oh, should we, like, we actually seriously talked about whether or not we should recap the reboot for a second. Chris works at Bloomberg now, Rapstar, who we used to do it with. And we were like, no, we're adults. We can't do that. We were adults then. We were like adults then. But yeah, I definitely still have a place in my heart for it. And I will never forget interviewing actually Penn Badgley, who played Dan and who's now on You, like 7 years into Gossip Girl's run. And like, I had to do a phone interview with him about something. And we were both on the phone like, wow, we never thought it would last this long. It's going on for a real long time. You've both been on this show for 7 years. Oh my God. It was a moment of commiseration.
Megan also wanted me to ask you if you have watched the Gossip Girl reboot.
Oh, I did. Yeah. It was good.
Yeah.
It was great. Yeah. Great outfits. I mean, it delivered.
I've enjoyed this conversation so much, Jessica. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I'm so glad that we got to talk. It was really nice to speak to you.
Yeah, nice to meet you. And good luck with your book. I can't wait to read it.
Good luck with your book. Good luck with your book as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, great.
This episode of the Sunday Long Read podcast was produced by Megan McDonald and Etienne Lajoie. The co-founders of the Sunday Long Read newsletter are Jacob Feldman and me, Don Van Natta. If you like the podcast, you can support us by following us on your favorite platform. And make sure to check out the newsletter if you haven't already. You can subscribe at sundaylongread.com/subscribe. Thanks again to Jessica. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again soon.